The mission of the Safe Return Project is to end mass incarceration and mass criminalization of individuals and communities impacted by the carceral state. Our belief is that we need to invest in the leadership of those most impacted and build urgency around those communities to be able to create change and reform. We help people navigate systems of services so that they can get on their feet and that they can be economically stable, but also be stably housed while they're learning to be leaders in their community.
Some formerly incarcerated people feel like they don't belong in the community because of their background. What we really do here is just reunification, bringing them back in the community, having them do grassroots leadership, having them speak to community about their experience and their story and how they got to where they were.
It's rough out there for a black male growing up in America, and the streets is treacherous. There's no real end for that, besides death or prison. So coming into Safe Return, it just changed my outlook on seeing things and gave me a support system that really helped me change my mind and my thinking process. The fellowship, it gave me time to allow to work on myself, to see the bad choices I was making, and it helped me focus on that. So that was very important to me.
Some of us didn't have the resources we needed to be successful originally. Most of us are just really starting to live our lives, no matter how old we are, because we never had that opportunity to thrive and survive in a healthy community. And now we get to envision that by being a part of an organization that believes in first chances.
My hope for the future is that we could actually eliminate racism, oppression, white supremacy, so that our children of our future can thrive and be successful.
My call to action to funders, donors, community members, folks who have been impacted, please make room for people impacted by the pain of incarceration and criminalization at the table of where decisions are being made, especially around funding and where movement dollars go, because most likely those are the folks who are going to know what needs to happen and where that investment needs to take place in the community. Invest in the Safe Return Project and the work that we're doing here in Contra Costa County, because it doesn't just impact Contra Costa. Safe Return has passed reform that has been nationally recognized and replicated, not just in California, but in other states. When I look at these systems that we're under, I don't think they're meant to love and nurture us. And I look at it as one big bully that we have to fight and correct. And I think that we should always think about investing in people over systems and investing in healing over harm. That's just some very deep self-reflection and healing that I've been able to do as a formerly incarcerated convicted person myself. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
This is going to be such an amazing conversation. So, hello to everybody out there in Facebook land. Really appreciate you all for coming out tonight. And if you are watching this on YouTube, our YouTube folks, thank you so much. Before we get into introductions, just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you are on YouTube, please drop a line in the comments. If you have questions, you want to add to the conversation, don't forget to comment. If you are on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, give us some thumbs up for our work. If you are on Facebook, live watching this, hit that like button, share this live with everybody who you know who should be involved in this really important conversation tonight, because it is really going to be an amazing conversation around how do we transition to a more just world? How do we have a just transition from extractive economies, and how do we push transformative narratives for long-lasting change. So I am Tamisha Torres-Walker, Executive Director and co-founder of Safe Return Project. The Safe Return Project's 10-year mission has been to end mass incarceration and mass targeted criminalization of Black people, people of color, and poor communities, and to re-enfranchise individuals and communities disenfranchised by criminalization and the carcerate state. And I am joined by Eli Moore, co-founder of the Safe Return Project, and also community partnership program manager at the Other and Belonging Institute. So how you doing, Eli? You want to check in with the people? You excited about this conversation today?
I'm fired up. I love this. I see some familiar names and I'm excited, surrounded by amazing people, and just blessed to join you, Tamisha, in this conversation. It's timely. Thanks for putting this together.
Yeah. So like I always say, like Eli, when we get together, like when you see us both in the room, so amazing change is gonna happen. This is like lack of a better phrase to use, partner in crime for mass liberation. We just ready to get everybody free and figure out how do we get there. As we said in the promotion of this, it's like, how do we get there together? So before we hop into our short presentation, because we definitely just want to get you all kind of positioned to understand where we're going with this dialogue tonight and how you can get involved, we want to raise up our Richmond Our Power coalition. Our folks, Richmond Our Power, who are this transformative narrative dialogue is a part of the Richmond Our Power Coalition Town Hall. So you support climate justice, environmental justice work, collective work for mass liberation. Please look up Richmond Our Power. Safe Return Project is a member of the Richmond Our Power Coalition. We'll dive a little bit more into that later. And I know the Other and Belonging Institute is doing a lot of work with our climate and environmental justice folks in Richmond. So we'll dive a little bit more into that moving forward. So if our Richmond Our Power folks are somewhere out there, drop the link to the website, link to the Facebook page, and how folks could get more involved in Richmond Our Power. So before we get into the presentation, I want to ground us in some collective values that we have been discussing for a while when we think about intersectionality among movements. How do we bring our work together for longer sustainability? We have been, since 2018, having these really deep conversations about, what are our collective values? And then what are the values we need to transcend in order to get free? And so some of what we came up with is that our values are that people who have been most harmed, who have been on the front lines of being incarcerated and burdened by pollution, must be the lead of social change. Those are frontline communities. The frontline communities should be in the lead for social change. Everyone has the right to resources they need to be whole, including reparations for injustices of the past. Healing for people and the land that has been harmed is necessary. This means transforming the root cause of these harms and establishing a regenerative systems. Love, care, and caring for all people with responsibility to current and future generations is a value we want to uplift. And then we are all caretakers for the earth and are interdependent within each other. So we need each other. We count on each other, right? And we have a duty and responsibility to this land, right? To the earth. And so there's also like this idea that we don't just need to we need to find a way to reconcile each other to ourselves and the earth, right? So that we can start that healing process. Now, some values that we collectively have been thinking about we need to actually transcend to make this possible is white supremacy. No more white supremacy and the belief in othering individuals, the othering people, criminal, the felon, the alien, all of that. Like, we need to do away with that, and the nature of how we address people as different and less than or less deserving. We also need to transcend the value of blame and punishment as an approach to harm and conflict. Individualism is also a value that we collectively say we need to transcend. And people and natural systems should be seen as under our current values are seen as resources to be exploited and used for monetary value and not necessarily for the collective whole or we in our communities. And the belief that some people and places will have to be sacrifice zones and are disposable. So we have to get rid of all of that. There are no throwaway people, no disposable people. We have to stop othering. We need to do away with white supremacy, patriarchy and capitalism and hyper individualism, and we have to gain new approaches to harm and conflicts in our community. So we have to transcend some of these other values for us to get to a more just world. Did I get everything, Eli? Is there anything you would like to add?
No, I think you named them. I think that it's interesting to think about this moment right now. We can get into this more later, but the way that the pandemic and the movements over the last year or two have really brought to the forefront, I think, more consciousness, especially around some of the limits and contradictions of these values that are currently so dominant, and some of the need for more awareness of our interconnectedness, more awareness that all people must have access to being what they need to be whole. So yeah, maybe we can talk more about that, but I'm excited about that statement.
Yeah, I am as well. And that was just a short list of values that we believe we need to transcend in order to move into this more just world that we all talk about. And, later on in the evening, we're going to talk about opportunities for you all to plug in, right? Because there's still more building we need to do around this work, and we have to do it together. So let's dive into our presentation really quick. We're just going to do a short presentation. It's not going to be expansive because it's really about having a conversation today. So again, welcome to our conversation around just world, just transition, and transformative narratives. Next slide. So how did the Safe Return Project come to be in environmental justice space, and how do we get linked up with Richmond Art Power? So in 2017, I received the email from the coordinator of Richmond Art Power and Daria Robinson of Urban Tilth, which is an anchor organization to Richmond Art Power in Richmond, California, not Richmond, Virginia, saying like, hey, we want to invite Safe Return to the table. And so we had a couple conversations, and the thing that I could not understand really was like, we are decarceration, decriminalization, criminal justice reform to abolish organization. Why will we be involved in a coalition that largely feels like an environmental climate justice coalition and not necessarily focused on issues around decarceration and mass criminalization? And so initially the invitation was to read some materials and come to a meeting. And then maybe we might also be able to work on some community engagement and civic engagement issues. Now, the Art Power Coalition has several different community community organizations at the table: Rich City Rides, Urban Tilth, Communities for a Better Environment, APEN, ACE, just to name a few. All coming together to think through this huge conversation around a just transition from extractive economies to regenerative economies, right? And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, it's still environmental justice. But then Rotha Lyle, the then coordinator, sent me a link to watch a video on just transition, and I made so many connections, and we'll get into that later. But really grateful for that invitation to that table, which got us here today. So again, thank you, Richmond Our Power Coalition, for the invitation, and also remaining a really strong community partner and thought partner. We have done barbecues against CDCR together. We've marched in Soul to Soul together. We've done community assemblies and community outreach to find out what is the needs in the community together. So hopefully we get to keep doing that work together in the community of Richmond. And then hopefully we can also just start to talk about this at the county level, which is so important for a lot of our struggling communities right now. Next slide. So one of the things that that we have been looking over is this strategy framework for a just transition, and I'm wondering, Eli, if you would be willing to dive in and kind of explain this a little bit for folks who probably seeing it for the first time or haven't really heard about it or thought about it.
Okay, so in a couple minutes, what do we want to take on this?
Just the overview. It's like, it looked like one side is the extractive economy side, so that's where we at now. That's where we are, where resources are seen are being extracted. So natural resources are being extracted. Our labor meaning work is manipulated and for profit. Let me see. I can't really. My screen is super small.
So this is a really deep, like, big picture framework. So we've got kind of the whole system of our current extractive economy, what worldview it's based on, what its purpose is, what the economy is organized towards, the enclosure of wealth and power, what the governance structure is for it, control and militarism, and what the resources are that go into it, that are treated as disposable resources, burn, dump, to pull out resources. And so then the middle part is the transition. And arrows represent kind of the movement from our current economy to the regenerative economy. So the work is to stop the bad parts, the harm of the current economy, the extractive economy, and to start to build the systems, the practices, the models for the regenerative economy. And to do that, we have to divest from some things and we have to invest in other things. So we have to withdraw our investment, our energy, our money, our attention towards the harmful pieces of the extractive economy, and we have to invest in what's needed, what the forms of work will be, what the forms of organizing and governance will be, what are the values and worldview that will guide the regenerative economy, and what are the resources and what are the systems for regenerating those resources. So it's about the big picture shift and kind of how we get there at the deepest level of beliefs and systems.
Thank you.
And this comes out of, like, it. Go ahead.
No, I was saying thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give credit to Movement Generation and Our Power for developing this. I think many people around the world have come to appreciate how powerful and useful this framework is, and it's beautiful work that they continue to do.
Yes, thank you. Our Power, Movement Generation folks, for providing this framework for us all to kind of, build upon. Next slide. So, as you can imagine, so after looking at this framework, watching the a short YouTube clip for on like how do we transition from extractive economies to regenerative economies, some of the connections I immediately made. So if we go back to when folks heard me originally say, like, why would Safer Term be invited to this table? And so when I thought about it, like, we have a common struggle between decarceration movements for mass liberation and freedom. We have a common struggle with movements for climate change and environmental justice, right? And so the common struggle is around resources, right? We're constantly fighting for resources for our community, for work to be productive, but also dignified, right? Cultures. So like around narratives and like worldview, and how do we see each other, our communities, the world, and then what are the dominant narratives and how do we defeat those? And then democracy, small d democracy, around voice. So just really our common struggle is around equity and dignity, is kind of the connections that Safer Term made to really just say, okay, we do need to be at this table. Next slide. The other thing that was clear to us was that we have a common enemy, right? And we say like the common enemy is white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, but those are huge, right? And the reality is like extraction. So when we first came to the table and it was like extractive economies and talking about extracting natural resources from the land, the first connection that Safer Term made was like, well, the prison industrial complex is also an extractive economy in that they extract whole people out of community for the purpose of profit, right? And exploitation of labor as well. And then it's also just this investment in like the endless growth in the criminal legal system and the carceral state, despite the historical impacts and the consequences later on down the line that we see. And it is also done by force. And it's all about wealth and power. So it was just like a light bulb went on and was like, yes, we need to be at this table as Safer Term, as a decarceration, decriminalization organization, because if we're going to be investing in transitioning to a more just world, this just transition can't be complete with the carceral state intact. Got it? Great. So next. So,
got it.
Like really diving in, right? Really diving in and saying, yes, we belong at this table. So now how do we throw down credibly and intuitively and strategically without mission drifting, right? And so our mission shifting. And so that's when I started having conversations with Eli. Eli reached out and was like, I've been doing some climate work. I've been doing some work around, climate, but then also like the intersectionality of different movements. Let's have a conversation. And that's where we first started to talk about like this kind of collective narrative framework by which mass liberation, which is really work around decarceration, decriminalization, and even like this new work around, reimagining public safety and like environmental justice, and like coming together and saying like, you know, what is purposeful about these two movements, recognizing our common struggle and our common enemy, and what are the benefits down the line. And we have invested like what 2018, 19, the last 3 years in like building on this conversation. And we're at a point now where we're ready to start having some of this dialogue publicly and sharing what we have been coming up with. And so that's where we are now. We just want to give a shout out to the East Bay Community Foundation, San Francisco Foundation, and Open Society and others for funding just like the beginning of what we see as a long journey of work to kind of help us all get free, not just locally in the city of Richmond, California, or in Contra Costa County or California, but hopefully nationally at the intersection of our movements. And that is the end of our short presentation. I hope I was able to really like frame that a little bit for this discussion. And I just want to like ask, did I leave anything out, Eli, or is there anything you would like to add?
Well, one thing I've heard you and others say is just pointing out how people are whole people. They're not a single issue. And if you organize in a way that only tells a story about a single issue, or only really prioritizes experiences related to a single issue, then you're only really speaking to part of ourselves, right? And not only that, but we know that divide and conquer is so often a response to any sort of organizing for justice. And we regularly see how communities like Richmond are told, you got to choose between your health or your job. You can't limit pollution because that's how you're going to get jobs. And if you want jobs for people coming home from incarceration, then you have to give up on protecting your air that you breathe. And so we know that for strategic reasons and just for moral reasons, drawing these connections is really an imperative.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, because as we talk more about just how we got here, it is making these connections, right? Like, how do we understand the importance of the connections between these movements, especially for mass liberation, environmental justice and climate justice, right? But there's also just like, as we have been moving forward, we're making a lot of connections, right? Around, you could throw immigration, right? You know what I mean? The fights around citizenship in there. You can throw the fights around housing in there, like how we have this narrative that we have a lot of homeless people. No, people are unhoused in their homes, if that makes sense. If Richmond is my home, right, I'm not homeless, I'm unhoused, right? And so how do we have these real conversations, but make sure that when we're doing our work, is like we're on the peripheral of each other's movements. And most often what happens is when we get a victory somewhere else, somebody suffers, right? And so we want to have movement work where there are no losers. Except for the people who were fighting against the systems that we're fighting against, we want them to lose, but for their own good. Right? It's kind of like, when Mark Peterson, our former district attorney, was facing possible charges for, misappropriating campaign funds. I was like, good for him. We have a system of reentry now, right? we built that, brother. We knew you was gonna need us. So this is really good. So I think understanding the connections are important across movements for longer sustainable wins. I think we leave communities out a lot, even in the work in California, the criminal legal reform work, all of the like great work that folks have been doing just since I've been involved in my short 11 years in this work. We have left a lot of people out. We have left a lot of people out. We have left people without dignified work, without housing, and we need to change that. So I'm just wondering, like, when you reached out to me, Eli, why was that important for you? Because I know I was thinking about it internally myself and like struggling with how to do it. And then when you reached out, it gave me an opportunity to have a thought partner. But it seems like you have been thinking about the connection between movements for a while.
Well, really, John Powell brought this forward at the Institute many years ago, making and one of the kind of core observations he was making was about how so often the kind of underlying worldview and values and narratives that we bump up against that hold back the work, we steer clear of to win on an issue, to win on a campaign, to win a policy. And so, for example, we might even repeat certain stories that are ultimately really harmful and limiting, such as, small government is better, or hyper individualism is okay. And when we do that, sometimes it's practical in the short term, right? You can argue that some policies are cheaper and more efficient and are going to save money, and that's really the reason why they're needed. And you might win some people over with that argument. But those underlying beliefs about small government, ineffective government, competition, scarcity, they come back to haunt us every time, and they really prevent the type of change across the different issues and across communities that is needed. And so the work around kind of what's the bigger we, what's the cross-cutting narrative, how do we tell that deeper story, is work to try to unearth some of those major obstacles that we come up against, whether we're working on the justice system or the climate crisis or justice for youth or all these different issues. So that's kind of where we were coming as an institute and interested in working with folks like you, Tamisha, on what that would sound like and how a community would lead a process to develop those deeper stories in a way that really resonates, that's really authentic, that feels real, and gets underneath the surface.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I mean, I felt all of that. Like I felt all of it because it's so true. And I feel like there were a couple starts and stops in California where even just across our building healthy communities work, where we tried to do this like collective narrative thing that almost felt like it didn't really lead to like this transformative collective narrative, like not in so much as words. It was just like some values, right? And then the acknowledgement of like the devastating impacts to our communities and like how we worked really hard to change some of that, but then being able to hone in on like what people consider to be like, well, what's the secret sauce to shifts, and then what do we do to sustain those wins? So it's not enough to win, but it's also how you sustain those wins. But to win, you shouldn't have to sacrifice another community. So that's super important. Some of the things that and then we want to get into like what's happening right now in our communities. What we're tackling right now with this work is that it's a project. It's about an 18-month project to really dive deep and do some research around current movements, historical movements, the impacts. What does sustainability look like, and how do we just raise the level of conversation so that we can move our move the work forward, not just at the intersection, but how do we bring our movements together? And so some of the questions we're asking ourselves, and you all can join in this too, because we want to hear about what you all are asking yourselves about this work, about this conversation. So if you have questions that's coming up for you right now, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Go ahead, type it if you're on Facebook, put it in the comments if you're on YouTube. We want to hear from you. But the questions we're raising up right now is, how do our movements with shared values, rooted in some of the same communities, advance a shared story that can advance transformation for all of our community, everyone in our community, right? No throwaway people. Remember, our value is that everyone is worthy and contributes. What are the commonalities across movements that could foster stronger collaboration and movement melding? So bringing our movements together, allowing us to challenge and overtake our common enemy, right? So the challenge is that, like, I used to hear, in PICO, which is now Faith in Action, when I was involved with that work, is like an organized lie beats the disorganized truth, right? So we got to make sure that no matter what room we go in, no matter what movement we're a part of, that we're saying the same thing about what mass liberation means and will look like. And for this project, we are proposing that we would investigate current and past movements for mass liberation that will allow us to develop a framework to help organizations and oppressed groups move out of our silos and work collectively to mobilize for social change. So and you might think to yourself, well, that's not hard. We could just answer those questions right now. But the reality is that the more we dive in, the more we look at our past, current movements, and what we're struggling with even today, more questions arise for this work. And so I've just been really grateful to have, thought partnerships in the environmental justice, climate justice community, as well as the community for decarceration and mass liberation, to think through these things, and a great partner like the Other and Belonging Institute to move this work forward with. So is there anything you would add, Eli, just around like where are we currently as we like move this conversation forward to present day, like right now experiences?
I feel like we're in a really kind of pivotal historical moment right now, and I'm excited to ask you a question about that. But I think, the pandemic, the resurgence of explicit, violent white supremacy, and the amazing movement for Black liberation, for climate justice, for Indigenous rights. It's just a lot of kind of assumptions are being questioned and challenged in some really exciting ways, and are much, much, much needed. And so I want to ask you about all of this work around reimagining public safety, because there's just been amazing energy around it locally and nationally. And we've both been in that. And I want to ask you, stepping back and kind of looking at it, what are some of the things you think this movement has achieved, and how do you think it has moved us forward toward a transition away from mass incarceration?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's been a real struggle in our communities, right? Like, communities are complex, and so when we've been having this conversation around reimagining public safety, it's been a struggle for some of our folks, and some people have kind of like gotten it right away, right? So for safer term, we get it, right? Justice reinvestment is a tactic, it's a strategy, right? And so we've been doing that work for the last 10 years. Of safe return, just straight justice reinvestment work, moving millions if not billions of dollars away from our criminal legal system, the criminalization of folks in our community, into like resources to keep people out of jails and prisons, right? And then continuing to move that work to the advocacy policy side of things to make sure that we're keeping people in community when they return home, and then also advocating for the necessary resources and what needs to take place in communities around safety and other issues to prevent more people from going into the criminal legal system in the first place, especially young people. So like, I think when you call, I think like the real call around reimagining public safety that just makes it so important to transition us away from mass targeted incarceration is the acknowledgement that public safety is about resources, not enforcement, right? And that those resources need to be available to the most vulnerable communities to prevent the pipeline to jails and prisons for unhoused folks, people with mental health issues, disabled folks, people who exist in dark bodies, so it shouldn't, your situation shouldn't be the reason why you end up in the criminal legal system, right? Poor education shouldn't lead you to a cell, right? Not having proper or healthy food options shouldn't lead you to jail, right? Which also doesn't have healthy food options, which why prisoners organize inside jails and prisons to fight for better food options and are doing gardening, right? So it's so important to get those resources. Like, this movement around reimagining public safety won't only achieve a transition of like resources to their proper place to make our community safe, but it will also prevent mass targeted incarceration of our most vulnerable communities, which is very important. Really, really important. And yeah, and I know, I mean, just as we're making a lot of the conversation around, the connections between environment and mass incarceration, just like even during the pandemic, me and you, we've been talking about making some of those worthy connections around how doing like a biological it took a biological crisis to release hundreds if not thousands of people from prison who should have been released anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
right.
Stuff we've been trying to bring home from jails and prisons for years only got like, and they told us everything we were told was impossible was made possible through a biological crisis. It should not have to take environmental and biological crisis for like us to make systems work and to set people free. So, I mean, in the last year, we saw 2 refineries in Contra Costa shut down fossil fuel production. And this has brought many more people into the awareness of the need for a just transition away from fossil fuels. So I guess my question for you is, when we are thinking about this transition, this just transition, what are the connections we should be making to form the justice system? And I don't call it I hate calling it the criminal justice system. It's
Yeah.
like there's no justice there. Just,
Yeah.
we haven't even really decide what justice means or looks like, really. But yeah, so what are the connections we should be making to transforming the justice system?
Well, one is, I think that it's deep just to recognize that the communities that are fence line communities to the refineries are often the communities that have been hit hardest by over policing, mass incarceration, um, shifting of resources towards punitive systems. And so the loss of a refinery um, in those communities, it may be a gain, a win for air quality and for the climate for sure. But then you see communities that are actually pitted against themselves because of the loss of tax revenue, the loss of jobs, loss of contracts with businesses. And so the transition is going to happen in one way or another, like they say, but how it happens and who benefits and who decides and who's harmed is to be determined. And so I think the question of transitioning these refinery towns has to be also a question of what do reparative investments look like for the harm to health, for the divestment from these communities, and how does the transition make those investments so that these communities can be thriving, healthy communities that are so that we can really have an equitable region. And you can see in places like Richmond where Chevron and the police union were kind of the two main forces running this city for multiple decades. And what we were left with was a community where the refinery was really allowed to contaminate in all kinds of ways. And the police were really allowed to behave in all kinds of harmful ways. And so there's a connection there too in like the political structures that shape our communities, and in the transition that needs to be made in terms of governance and government and political power.
Yeah, those, I mean, it's just like all of these like light bulbs coming on around. I remember when there was this big fight to was it to revitalize Chevron or for Chevron to become cleaner or
Yeah, the
something.
modernization.
Right, the modernization of like, I'm like, well, we're gonna modernize Chevron. They're still gonna be a polluter, but they're not gonna pollute as much, right? So it's like they're like, there'll be, when there was like this narrative that there won't be, that the attack wasn't necessarily was against jobs, right? There was this huge narrative around like, oh, this is going to bring more jobs, and the people who are against it just don't want jobs. When really, if we slow down, the argument was, well, if we have to coexist with this major polluter who has never paid their dues to the community, then at least there should be good, clean, sustainable jobs, right? and the fact that like there were really two competing narratives around, well, what would the new, would it, I felt then, back then, there were conversations budding around the potential for a new economy when it came to Chevron and what it could look like around jobs, even though it would still remain to be a major polluter in our community. And the reality was like Chevron could never pay enough money to reconcile the harm to the Richmond community, right? So, like, I would say, like, justice would be if they paid the medical bills for every Richmond resident and their descendants for the rest of our lives and generations, and they still wouldn't make up for the harm that they've done as a major polluter. So that's yeah,
Yes.
that's where I'm at with
Yeah.
that, but I'll leave it there.
Let me ask you a question, Tamisha. So, kind of looking at it from the other angle in terms of what's going on with California's prison system right now. There have been some major wins. Voters in California have finally started to support, initiatives that decriminalize some offenses, and the courts have forced California to start to downsize its prison system, and for other reasons, they're actually planning to close a couple prisons. And recently, we've seen that the community in Susanville is worried that their prison, the prison in Susanville, is going to be shut down, and so there's some kind of transition and happening with the prisons. And I want to ask you, is a just transition a helpful way of thinking about prison closures too, or how would you help us think about that?
Absolutely. I think when I first had a chance to think about it, it was when I heard about Kentucky, and I heard about like Kentucky and the work there around coal mines. So like the fight against coal and closing the coal mines, and like how it's toxic, really toxic, harmful work. And so we sent the organizer up there with a delegation from Our Power, Richmond Our Power, to kind of just check it out, one of our folks. And then coming back, some of the conversations we had was just like, what we found out was that while they're advocating to shut down coal, a private prison was being proposed as the new economy. And so it was just like, oh no. It was one of those situations where we're like, we're going to win on environmental justice and we're going to lose if we let a private prison get built, right? So again, just going back to, winning for one community, winning for one movement, but creating a loss for another movement if we're not intentional about how we come together about our work. And so when I'm thinking about Susanville, and we've had this conversation a couple times, is like closing prisons, like it is absolutely important to downsize this very extractive economy, right? Like the prison industrial complex, it is an extractive economy. It extracts bodies and labor, and gets free labor for profit or at extremely low slave wages or no wage at all, right? So we definitely need to do away with it. I think like this trend of like closing down prisons is important. It'll force us to think differently about how we focus on harm and violence in the community, especially around reduction, right? I think the challenge with that is that in a lot of these rural communities where the prison is the local economy, the challenge has always been when when Safe Return first started and we were doing this work, we used to talk all the time about how the fight is really people's jobs, right? People are always worried about the paycheck, right? And so some of the things is like when you fight against prison system, you're fighting against workers, people who are getting paid. They're sitting there, they're basically paying their mortgages, sending their kids to school, and taking care of themselves basically on the backs of other people being harmed, right? So you're literally working for a horrible system, but you're making good money. Well, if you can make that money, that same money in the community and not have to work in this system, would you still choose to work in this system? And that's the struggle. So in Susanville, where they're talking about shutting down this prison, the argument isn't we need to keep the prison for matters of public safety. The argument is we need to keep the prison because if we don't keep the prison, all of these people will lose their jobs. The small businesses that provide food for the workers and people who come visit their families will go out of business because they no longer will make money. The school system possibly shutting down because all of the people who might leave because they no longer have a job there. So then they won't be able, there'll be not enough kids. So it's so weird because this entire existence of this rural community, the entire economy is this prison. That's like an extreme miscarriage of economic justice. And how did we let that happen are the questions that we need to say to each other. And somebody needs to be in this community having a conversation around a new economy that is not extractive, that is regenerative, and that it provides work with dignity and can help this rural community build sustainable wealth that isn't based or predicated on the extraction of human bodies from our community for profit. So it's very I don't excuse my language. It's so bad. And I'm hoping that's what I'm hoping we can continue, to work this out. And that's like a current case. And I think it's so important to look at these different models and help us build on this like just transition from the extractive economy that we know as the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder where we would be right now if California had built 20 universities instead of 20 prisons in the 80s and 90s. We'd be in a whole different place. And that financing could have been used for that. That would have produced just as many jobs, if not a lot more.
And housing.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. I would like to go back to the pandemic a little bit, because I know early on I had talked about a little bit about the pandemic and things that we experienced during that time, that strides we made during a biological crisis that we were told we would never be able to make when it came to like liberating people from cells and prisons and getting people home to their community in the around mass liberation work. But what do you think, what are some of the like elements you think we learned from COVID-19 that relates to the work of just transition?
Well, one thing I think is important for all of us to be thinking about right now is what stories get told about the pandemic and what we remember, because stories help us remember. And this pandemic has shook up so many things and has affected people in so many different ways. And I think the stories that last about why the pandemic happened, what effect it had, and what it taught us about who we are and what matters in life will have lasting effects for a generation. And so I think we should all be thinking about what are the stories we tell and what are we going to remember. I think one of the things you named earlier is really important, which is there are solutions that we were told for many, many years were not feasible, that we learned were feasible during the pandemic. And so we saw the early releases. We also saw people without shelter get hotel rooms. and that there was money for hotel rooms. And that was the right thing to do. But it also could have been done before. And so some of the scarcity narratives about, that's just not possible, there just aren't resources for that, they proved false. I think another one that I hope we remember is our interdependence, our interconnectedness, that when somebody in our community is sick or isn't well, that it affects us, and that everybody being well is better for everyone, and that's a right that everybody should have. And I think a lot of people who had privilege saw themselves suddenly a little bit closer to that safety net, or needing that safety net, and saw that like there are a lot of holes in that safety net, and I don't want to fall in that. And so I hope that there's some greater commitment to basic rights and needs being met for all people. Yeah, we learned about like essential work and essential systems. We all need food. We all need shelter. We all need water. And there's a lot of other work that's good and important, but there are these essential systems that we have to have. And when it comes to the climate crisis, those systems are at jeopardy. Like literally, what do you do when your water runs dry? What do you do when your food system fails? Those are bigger problems than my office job. So I hope that some of that sticks with us.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you had churches and food pantries feeding working families, people who were not lining up for food pantries were now lining up. Like the same systems that like poor people, poor low income people, people with no money or little wealth have been using for decades to survive were suddenly overwhelmed by people with jobs, right? Or who have been laid off work. So then the people who had the most need, now that system is also overwhelmed, right? And so, and like when we say essential, one thing that I don't want to leave out of the conversation, and I want to move us forward, is that, local governments need to thank nonprofit organizations. Literally saved your behinds and your community during the pandemic. So when we talk about like telling the story of like what happened during this pandemic, like cities need to thank the nonprofits that stood in the gap when they didn't have the resources to feed people, to put people into shelter, to track people and make sure that people were getting what they need. And then also like the movement organizations who kept working to make sure that folks who were already struggling before the pandemic got what they needed and some dignity and continued that work on the ground. Like we have to tell that story too. And I mean, that's the number one thing I said is like, what would we have done without the nonprofits, movement leaders, and churches during the pandemic? And we need to tell that story for sure.
Yeah.
Because the community-based organizations, community leaders, individuals got up and really served the community. And it also helped us recognize that our local tax dollars were also not working for us, which is why there's this big push around reimagining public safety.
Can I ask you, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So, what probably everyone wants to know is you're on city council now, council member Torres-Walker, as is Claudia, my partner, and many other community leaders, movement organizers. Folks are stepping up to be in government and work towards transforming these institutions from the inside as well as the outside. And you've been involved in policy work for many years in advocacy. Now you're inside local government. And so I want to ask you what kind of, reflections, observations you have on that experience so far.
Man, it is. Oh, you hit me with the tough question. After I said local governments need to get their stuff together because we are failing our communities, right? They elected us, to represent them. It's been an adjustment period to go from the front line to the dais, making those decisions. I'm like, I'm the person who I would protest against.
Right. Governance.
So it's just, it's really eye-opening. The first thing I acknowledge coming in is we didn't create this system. So it wasn't meant to navigate easily, to promote collaboration, or even to really implement basic solutions. And when I say basic, I don't mean just like basic, but just basic solutions to, like, we need housing for the homeless. There's food insecurity. There are connectivity issues. Like, some of the most basic things, this system that we did not create makes it hard to navigate and collaborate. And so when we talked about things that values we need to transcend, and individualism being one of them, like, this system has a lot of capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy built into it, and it's very individualized. And even when you go to districts, it just made it worse. And people, I appreciate the district elections because it can put some equity in there. But if you didn't get a good map, what you got is modern day redlining, right? Mm-hmm. And so, being a representative of the largest, like the district with the most poor working class people, is been a challenge because it's hard to navigate a government that has not caught up to the growth of the community, but also hasn't really, like, most of our public services hasn't really served our community. And so I also am now starting to have a little empathy for some of our elected leaders, not all of them. Some of our elected leaders who have been leading for a long time. Some of our elected leaders who've been in those seats for a long time have gotten a little, like, lame or tired, or they're not moving stuff as much. And what I recognized is because of this. It's because of a lot of, I instantly came in and understood why we get lame after a while. It's really, you either completely sell out on your values, or you just get tired of navigating a system that wasn't meant to serve, that's really meant to serve itself, and not necessarily the community. So I think that's been the challenge that I've seen as an organizer now in this elected position. Is it's not as easy. It's easier to organize on the front line in the community as it is to get a majority vote on a city council. And it's a system that needs to be changed. and transformed. Um, it gives
Are there
it
any
poses.
examples you want to give of that?
I think, well, I mean, one of the examples that I would give is like, okay, I wanted to create a office of community resources and public safety for the city of Antioch. And the reason why is because immediately coming in, I noticed that the city needed some realignment, and that resources weren't like, you couldn't tell a city resource, how is a city partner with community for community resources, and then adding the public safety pieces, because we have regulated our public safety to policing, but public safety means these other things, right? Like services for homeless folks, environmental issues, etc. Right? Partnerships with nonprofits, equity projects through cannabis, all of that can add to public safety. And so, while advocating for this office, like, it's five of us on the council, so you need 3 votes to move anything, but you can only talk to one other person.
Mm-hmm.
You can only talk to one other person, and you need 3 votes. So you really have to like have a clear thought partner who is willing to roll with you. And then you have to be able to articulate that vision effectively at the dais, to the community, and to your peers. And you have to hope that you get to one other person, that you make one other individual curious enough to move it forward. And then you have to hope that the buy-in continues to grow to actually get to your 3rd vote to pass it to the next level of implementation, right? So it's like, pass it. And fortunately, Monica Wilson was a good partner with that, and her and myself was able to articulate that to the council, and then we got the votes we needed to move forward.
Right.
And so that was a huge victory, but now it's implementation.
Yeah.
So it's not enough just to get something through. You also have to stay at the table to make sure that it's implemented effectively. Same as organizing on the ground. So I'm just trying to transfer a lot of the skills that I learned as an organizer to this space. And it's not easy. And the political climate is disgusting, especially for women of color and Black women right now. And so really most of what I'm doing is just trying to like be safe while I'm doing this much needed work, and then also be okay with being a one-term candidate if that's what occurs. Because we really shouldn't be running to get reelected. We should be running to create change. And if you do the change effectively, and the people in the community could feel like they're getting, like, I don't want to know how the clean water gets to my faucet. I just want to turn on my faucet and have clean drinking water. As long as that happens, then, you can, you can hopefully continue to represent your community. This was really, this was a really good conversation. Thank you so much, Eli, for always being a great thought partner. And I mean, I know that, there's struggle on both ends, right? Because there's still lots of grassroots work that need to be done in the community. And we also got to figure out, well, how do we align our work? Because also, reimagining public safety work is there's absolutely a deep conversation that need to be had around violence prevention, right? And there's also a deep conversation that need to be had around how do we protect each other and love one another. The reality is somehow we have dropped the ball in our communities. We have stopped protecting each other, and we have relegated that protection to these systems that don't love us, and really ultimately don't protect us. Their job is to protect capital and property, right? Not people. So we have to enforce laws that most often we do not create. And so we have, or participate in the creation of. And so we have to think differently about this work. So, I mean, we don't know if folks drop stuff in the chat. We would like to dialogue with you. If you have any questions for us, we would love for you to throw those questions out there. We know that we had definitely extended the invitation if folks wanted to come on and join in the conversation with us. If that was something that you wanted to do. We understand, sometimes it's difficult to get on social media. People don't just want to be like out there, but we really appreciate everybody who did just join in and joined into this conversation, even if it was on Facebook Live or on YouTube. And we want to keep hearing from you all. And I mean, the next question, just like overall, is, as we talk about our hopes, our hopes for this work and our hopes for the future of like the work around mass liberation, environmental justice, but like the intersection of movements and how we come together for larger sustainable wins over time, right? And for our narratives to really take root in our community is like, what are some of the solutions? So here's a question: is like, what are some of the ways, the solutions to the climate crisis can also be solutions to mass, our crisis around mass targeted criminalization. So we'll have, I know you thinking about that, Eli. I'm thinking about that. And we want others to be thinking about that. So what are some of the solutions? How can solutions for the climate crisis also be solutions for mass liberation and decarceration and vice versa? And I think we do have a question. What is the question? Well, where do we start? Where does one person start? As an organizer, I want to say one individual person can start by having everything you heard here today. Go talk about it with another person. Right? Have a one-to-one, have a conversation, share this information. If you didn't already, click, like and share this live, with your networks and your folks. Like, don't just leave this conversation here. Take it back to your community and get involved in a movement organization that's doing this work. You could definitely join up with us as we continue to build out our transformative narrative work. This is an ongoing body of work. So you can, go to Safe Return website and sign up to volunteer and get involved in the work. You can email me directly if you want to get involved in the work. Other Than Belonging is a partner to this work. So if you want to get more involved in the work of the Other Than Belonging Institute, you can definitely reach out to Eli and get in contact with Eli. We'll drop Eli's email for you all if you want to talk to him a lot more about what is Other Than Belonging thinking about this and how you can plug in from that angle as well, especially if you're an academic or even just a community member who interested in the research side. Those are just some of the ways you as one individual could get involved. And it would just start with sharing this information, sharing this live, and having a conversation around a just transition from extractive economies to regenerative economies, but also how do we, do our movement work more collaboratively. Anything you would add, Eli?
Find an organization that's led by people who are most impacted by the work and has a real accountability structure and a culture that feels right to you. That's all I would say.
Yeah, it's really important to keep the conversation going. We did a workshop, so we kicked this off, and then we're we were shut down by the pandemic, but we definitely will be having a workshop, pretty soon. I think it's going to be virtual, right, Eli?
We'll
Um,
see, I guess.
we want to see if it could be like in person, if that's not possible, virtual, maybe a little bit of both, where we continue this work and building on this framework and this transformative narrative project in community with you all. The other thing is we'll be having conversations with folks, so doing interviews, dialogues, focus groups. So if you really want to throw down on this project, just get in contact with me or Eli to move forward. And I think we have another question. Safe return. How can you support safe return? Other than joining up with the work, becoming a volunteer. You can also just donate. I was saying while I was on the campaign trail, like every dollar makes change, and I was like, that's super corny, and it does. So donate to Safe Return. All donations matters. Large, small donations. Donate to our work. Help us continue to do this work in the community. Is very transformative work. Also, support, the work of the Other and Belonging Institute as well. But I think that's how you can support and get involved for sure. Join our advisory board. You feel like you have some free time, we definitely are looking for advisory board members to help us continue to build this amazing organization out to meet more need. So yes, just visit our website and it'll tell you how to volunteer, how to donate, and how to get involved. Any other questions? So let's go back to our last.
My connection's spotty.
It is. Can you hear me?
Yes.
See, internet. That's why we got to do this in person, people. Let's all get healthy so we can meet in person. Well, let's go back to this question around like solutions, or just like what do we hope for the future. Did you get a chance to think about this, Eli, as we get ready to close out?
Yeah, I'd offer some of the most exciting things we've talked about are investments in health and healing. So there are calls for health and healing from folks who are impacted by the justice system. And there are also calls for resources for health and healing from people who've been impacted by environmental racism, environmental justice, and the climate crisis. And so the kind of win-win. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. It was a little crackly there for a minute, but we can hear you.
So investments in health and healing and community health resources. I think another one is there is a ton of work to do to transition our communities and our economy to be resilient and build this regenerative economy. The problem is the corporations are not going to pay for it unless they're required to do so. And so there is plenty of work to be done. This is work that could be for young people, for old people, for people with not enough work, for people coming home from incarceration. And we can't let it be low wage jobs. We can't let it just be temp jobs. But we know how to do that. We can set high road standards. We can make these jobs union benefits, about the law regulations that apply. So I think that's another one to look at, kind of a solution that cuts across. What am I for you? You think about solutions.
When I think about solutions, I think about, you know, when we in like climate or environmental justice work, there is like this hyper focus on communities, and the solution is based in like community and the health, right? The health and welfare of communities, and then tying it to like, you know, the earth and next generation. And so like all of the solutions that we come up with today should help generations to come. And so how, if we did what we needed to do around the fossil fuel industry, and we can, get our air cleaned up, it's not just for us who are here right now, it's for generations to come, right? And so when I think about some of the way we talk generationally around climate change, we should also have our solutions around decarceration should also have those same frameworks when we speak of solutions, and not just temporary solutions, right? Because closing down a jail or a prison. Oh, can you hear me now? Am I muted? Evelyn? Eli? So, oh, sorry. I'm like, oh my God, either I'm frozen or Eli's frozen. Where was I? Closing, I think where I was saying is like closing down a jail or a prison. It doesn't really speak to the, well, what's next, right? What are we building from here? Like, right? So in order to say no to something, we have to say yes to something. So very often we're missing the what are we saying yes to? And I feel like we can build that out a lot more as we continue to think about the solutions around mass targeted incarceration of our people. Is that most often a policy or just the closure of a jail and prison is not the solution, right? That's just a strategy. And we need a more generational type of frame, similar to the environmental and climate justice work. And so that's where I'm hoping that, we have, a lot of our solutions have really been focused on like making sure that the people most impacted are leading the work, which is great. And also making sure that when we say, that the solution to economic dignity is that we bring dignity back to work, and that people have jobs that don't cost them their humanity. That's so important. And so I want people who work in prisons and jails to lose their jobs, because I want them to have a better life, right? The health outcomes are not different, right? And so just thinking of it like that, is that the solutions should lead to everyone having a better state of wholeness, is kind of what I've been thinking. So it's just like I have a lot of hopes for the future of this work, and hopefully for us to be able to like, share this framework with other communities who are also struggling with some of these same conversations, to provide some tools to kind of get the ball rolling. And today is just about that. If you're working at the peripheral of a collective, of a movement, why not have conversations around how both movements are fighting the same common enemy, how we have a common struggle, and how do we fight together to make sure that we develop narratives, transformative narratives that are rooted not just in a solution, but sustaining our wins for generations to come, which is so important. Did I miss anything?
Hey, I missed a little bit, but the part I came back for was amazing. I'm gonna have to listen to the recording later.
Yeah, we lost you. I was like, oh no, we lost Eli. But yeah, I think that's what, that's what I'm thinking about. And it's just, it's so, we really gotta, when we talk about economic dignity, we really have to tell this story that, like, you can't get rid of one extractive economy and replace it with a new extractive economy. We really have to think about not just our natural resources, but people as valuable resources as well. And how do we manage all of that while we're fighting for each other in our communities?
Yes.
But this has been really amazing conversation. Thank you, Eli, for putting up with me. Look, I drug
Thank you.
Eli.
What?
I'm like, I drug Eli here. Nah. Thank you for coming, join and being a part of this work, not just this conversation today. And we've been struggling with some of this stuff for 11 years, some of these questions. And so it's really exciting to be able to really have this work invested in. And we hope more people invest in this work as well. And so we will be having a second workshop. So stay in the loop on that for sure. We would love to have all of you involved with us to make sure that we are building out this framework to the benefit of all of our communities across this nation, because we all want to live in a more just world, and we can get there through narratives and a transition from these extractive economies. And so we really appreciate everybody. Again, if you didn't already, make sure you drop some love or, if you're on YouTube, give us the thumbs up. Please subscribe to our channel. And also leave some comments. If you're on Facebook, leave some comments, like this, share this, follow Safe Returns page. We really appreciate all of the support that we can get. And also support the work of the Other and Belonging Institute and the amazing work that they're doing over there. Really raising the level of consciousness and worldview of our communities. Super appreciate you, Eli, and all of the work that you all are continuing to do over there in Richmond. And we will be ending. We want to end with this amazing speech by Martin Luther King. We played it in the first part of our workshop, but we definitely it just made so much sense. And it's couched in the Poor People's Campaign. And we hope you all stick around to enjoy this clip. And remember to go to our website, sign up to get involved in this work. And you can also email me directly at Tamisha, all lowercase Tamisha, at safereturnproject.org. If you want to, contact me directly for any follow-up for this discussion.
Thank you, Tamisha. You are a visionary. Your persistence, your depth of commitment, your amazing work is an inspiration. So many people have been blessed by that, and I feel lucky to be in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Richmond Art Power, for sure, for all of your support. Remember to support Richmond Art Power, and continue. If you want to know more about the Richmond Art Power series and what's coming up next, please check out the Richmond Art Power Facebook page to get updates on that amazing collective work that's happening in Richmond, California.
Bye.
Hello, everyone. We're having some technical difficulties with pulling up the clip. What we'll do is we'll just post the clip on our Facebook page. You could come back to our Facebook page and actually watch it. It's very it's a piece of history, but very timely for this discussion. So make sure you come back to the Facebook page and watch that video. But what I'm really gonna do to close this out is just say that, like, you know, transitioning to a more just world is what we also need to do to save people's lives in our community. And so this broadcast tonight is dedicated to the memory of Derek McDougal, a young man who was a part of our Richer Boy Fellowship, who we lost to gun violence in the city of Richmond earlier this year. So just want to raise up Derek and say that this work is very important and it's life-saving work. And thank you, everybody, for all of your support.